going to make trouble. That was what women did best. It hardly surprised him to learn that Tom and Julian knew less about this bowl of winds than he did. After they left to ready themselves for a trip to the Rahad, he had time to set his clothes to rights before Nynaeve and Elaine came back. He had time to check on Oliver in his room one floor down. The boy's skinny frame had fleshed out somewhat, with Enid and the rest of the cooks of the Wandering Woman stuffing him, but he would always be short, even for a Kyrian. And if his ears shrank to half their size and his mouth to half its width, his nose would still stop him well short of handsome. No fewer than 3 serving women fussed over him while they sat cross-legged on his bed. "Matt, don't you think Hazel has a beautiful eyes?" Oliver said, beaming at the big-eyed young woman Matt had met the last time he came to the palace. She beamed back and ruffled the boy's hair. "Oh, but Alice and Goya are so sweet, I could never choose." A plump woman just short of her middle years looked up from unpacking Oliver's saddlebags, gave him a broad grin, and a slender girl with bee-stung lips patted the towel she had just put on his washstand, then flung herself onto the bed to tickle Oliver's ribs till he fell over laughing helplessly. Matt snorted. Parnan and that lot were bad enough, but now these women were encouraging the boy. How was he ever going to learn to behave if women did that? Oliver ought to be playing in the streets like any other 10-year-old. He had had no serving women falling over him in his room. I didn't see to that, he was sure. He had time to check on Oliver and to look in on Harnan and the rest of the Red Arms, sharing a long room lined with beds not far from the stables, and to saunter down to the kitchen for some bread and beef. He had not been able to face that porridge back at the inn. Still, Nynaeve and Elaine had not returned. He finally looked over the books in his sitting room and began reading the travels of Jane Farstrider, though he barely knew word for word. Tom and Julian came in, just as the women finally bustled in, exclaiming over finding him there, as if they thought he would not keep his word. He closed the book gently, set it gently on the table beside his chair. "Where have you been?" "Why, we went for a walk," Elaine said brightly, blue eyes wider than he remembered seeing before. Tom frowned and produced a knife from his sleeve, rolling it back and forth through his fingers. He very markedly did not so much as glance at Elaine. "We had some tea with some women your innkeeper knows," Nynaeve said. "I won't bore you with talk about needlework." Julian started to shake his head, then stopped before she noticed. "Please, don't bore me," Matt said dryly. He supposed she knew one end of a needle from the other, but he suspected she would as soon stick one through her tongue as talk about needlework. Neither woman cracked her teeth about civility, confirming his worst suspicions. "I've told off 2 fellows to walk out with each of you this afternoon, and there will be 2 more tomorrow and every day. If you're not inside the palace or under my nose, you'll have bodyguards. They know their turns already. They'll stay with you at all times. All times. And you will let me know where you're headed. No more making me worry till my hair falls out." He expected indignation and argument. He expected weaseling over what they had or had not promised. He expected that demanding this whole loaf might get him a slice at the end. A butt slice, if his luck was in. Nynaeve looked at Elaine. Elaine looked at Nynaeve. "Why, bodyguards are a wonderful idea, Matt," Elaine exclaimed, her cheek dimpling in a smile. "I suppose you were right about that. It's very smart of you to have your men already to a schedule." "It is a wonderful notion," Nynaeve said, nodding enthusiastically. "Very smart of you, Matt." Tom dropped the knife with a muffled curse and sat sucking on a nicked finger, staring at the women. Matt sighed. Trouble. He had known it. And that was before they had told him to forget the Rahad for the time being. Which was how he found himself on a bench in front of a cheap tavern not far from the riverfront called the Rose of the Elbar, drinking from one of the dented tin cups chained to the bench. At least they washed the cups out for each new patron. The stink from a dyer shop across the way only raised the style of the Rose. Not that it was a shabby neighborhood, really. though the street was too narrow for carriages. A fair number of brightly lacquered sedan chairs swayed through the crowd. If far more passers-by wore wool and perhaps a gilt vest than silk, the wool was as often as fringe. The houses and shops were the usual array of white plaster, and if most were small and even run down, the tall house of a wealthy merchant stood on a corner to his right, and on the left, a diminutive palace, smaller than the merchant's house at least, with a single green-banded dome and no spire. A pair of taverns and an inn in plain sight looked cool and inviting. Unfortunately, the Rose was the only one where a man could sit outside. The only one in just the right spot. Unfortunately. I doubt I've ever seen such splendid flies. Lacey grumbled, waving away several choice specimens from his cup. What is it we're doing again? You are swilling that foul excuse for wine and sweating like a goat, he muttered, tucking his hat to shade his eyes better. I am being Taviran. He glared at the dilapidated house, which was a establishment that he had been told to watch. Not asked, told. Never what it came to, however they phrased it, squirming around their pledges. Oh, they made it sound like asking, made it sound like pleading at the end, which he would believe when dogs danced. But he knew when he had been bullied. Just be Taviran, Matt, he mimicked. I know you'll just know what to do. Bah! Maybe Elaine's bloody daughter heir and her bloody dimple knew. Or Nynaeve with her bloody hands twitching to yank her bloody braid. But he would be burned if he did. If the pig-kissing bowl is in the Rahad, how am I supposed to find it on this blaming side of the river? I do not remember them saying, Julian said wryly, and took a long swallow of some drink made from a yellow fruit grown in the countryside. You have asked that 50 times at least. He claimed the pale drink was refreshing in the heat, but Matt had taken a bite of one of those lemons, and he was not about to swallow anything new from them. With his head still throbbing faintly, he himself drank tea. It tasted as if the tavern keeper, a scrawny fellow with beady, suspicious eyes, had been dumping new leaves and water in yesterday's leavings since the founding of the city. The taste suited his mood. He did not seem very secrets. Sometimes he was decidedly. What do Satala and these women have to do with the bowl? Women did pass in and out of the dilapidated house. A steady stream of women just about. Some well dressed. 3 or 4 wore the red velvet. Matt considered following some of them when they left, but it felt too planned. He did not know how Taviran looked. He had never really seen any sign of it in himself. His luck was always best when everything was random. Like with dice. Most of those little iron tavern puzzles eluded him, however lucky he felt. He ignored Tom. Asked at least as often as how he would find the bowl here. Nynaeve had told him to his face she had not promised to tell him every last thing she knew. She said she would tell him whatever he needed to know. She said. Watching her nearly choke and not calling him names was not nearly enough vengeance. I suppose I should take a walk down the alley, Elysian sighed, in case one of those women decided to come over the ground wall. The narrow gap between the house and the dyer lay in full view for its whole length. But another alleyway ran along behind the shops and houses. Matt, tell me again why we're doing this instead of playing cards. I'll do it, Matt said. Find out to hear what behind the garden. He went and found out nothing. By the time twilight began creeping over the street and Harnan came with a bald-headed, narrow-eyed Andoran named Watt, the only possible effect of being Taviran he had seen was that the tavern keeper brewed a fresh pot of tea. It tasted almost as bad as the old. Back in his room in the palace, he found a note, a invitation of sorts, elegantly lettered on thick white paper that smelled like a garden of flowers. My little rabbit, I expect to have you for dinner tonight in my apartment. No signature, but he hardly needed one. Light, the woman had no shame at all. There was a red-painted iron lock on the door to the corridor. He found the key and locked it. Then, for good measure, he jammed a chair under the latch on the door to Naram's room. He could do well enough without supper. Just as he was about to climb into bed, the lock rattled. Out in the hall, a woman laughed at finding the door secured. He should have been able to sleep soundly then, but for some reason he lay there listening to his belly grumble. Why was she doing this? Well, he knew why, but why him? Surely she had nothing to do with all decency over the barn. He was safe now, anyway. Pilot was not better than the door, after all. Would she? Not even most birds could get in through the wrought iron arabesques screening the balconies. Besides, she would need a long ladder to reach that high, and men to carry it.
The last joint of my passion fruit.
Or she could. The night passed, his stomach rumbled, the sun rose, and he never closed his eyes or had a decent thought. Except that he did make a decision. He thought of a use for the sulking room. He certainly never sulked. At first light, he sneaked out of his rooms and found another of the palace servants he remembered, a balding fellow named Madik, with a smug, self-satisfied air and a shy twist to his mouth that said he was not satisfied at all. A man who could be bought. Though the startled look that flashed across his square face and the smirk he barely bothered to hide, he knew exactly why Matt was doing it. Blood and ashes. How many people knew what Tylan was up to? Nynaeve and Elaine did not seem to, thank the light. Though that did mean they chided him about missing dinner with the Queen, which they had learned about when Tylan inquired whether he was ill. And worse. Please, Elaine said, smiling almost as if the word did not pain her. You must put your best foot forward with the Queen. Don't be nervous. You will enjoy an evening with her. Just don't do anything to offend her, Nynaeve muttered. There was no doubt with her that being Sybil hurt. Her brows drew down in concentration, her jaw tightened, and her hands trembled to pull her braid. Be accommodating for once in your... I mean to say. Remember she's a decent woman, and don't try any of your... Like, you know what I mean. Nervous? Huh? Decent woman? Huh? Neither seemed the least concerned that he had wasted a whole afternoon. Elaine patted his shoulder sympathetically and asked him please to try another day or two. It certainly was better than tramping through the Rahad in this heat. Nynaeve said the exact same thing, the way women did, but without the shoulder pad. They admitted right out that they intended to spend the day trying to spy on Carden without Remember, though they evaded his question of who it was they thought they might recognize. Nynaeve let that slip, and Elaine gave her such a look he thought he might see Nynaeve's ears boxed for once. They meekly accepted his stricture not to lose sight of their bodyguards, and meekly let him see the disguises they intended to wear. Even after Tom's description, seeing the pair suddenly turn into Abu Dhari women in front of his eyes was almost as big a shock as their meekness. Well, Nynaeve made a sickly stab at meekness, growling when she realized he had meant what he said about the Aiel woman needing no bodyguard. But she came close. Either one of these women folding her hands and answering submissively made him nervous. Both of them together, with Bobby Ender nodding approvingly, and he was happy to send them on their way. Just to be sure, though, he ignored their suddenly flat mouths and made them demonstrate their disguises for the men he was sending along first. Bannon leaped at the chance to be one of Elaine's guards, knuckling his forehead right and left like a fool. The fat man had not learned much watching on his own. Just as on the day before, a surprising number of people had come to call on Carden, including some in silk. But that was not proof they were all dark friends.
Hey,
All
Bassett,
said
how
and
you
done,
doing,
the man
bro?
was the White Cloak ambassador. More
Let me
folk
clean
wanted to
this
say that Wamedisia probably
container real
went
quick,
him
and I'll do a dab real
to
quick.
the Wamedisian ambassador, whoever he or she was. Bannon did say 2 women had definitely been watching Carden's palace too. The look on his face when Avienda suddenly turned into a third Abudari woman was a wonder. And also an old man, he thought, though the fellow proved spry. Bannon had not managed to get a good look at him despite spotting him 3 times. Once Bannon and the women left, Matt sent off Tom and Julian to see what they could uncover.
I'm about to do a
concerning
dab
Carden.
too. Just give me one
Thin,
second.
white-haired old man with an interest in dark friends. If the thief catcher could not discover where to put Carden on his face, it did not exist. And Tom seemed to have a way of putting together all the gossip and rumor in a place and filtering out the truth. All that was the easy part, of course. For 2 days, he sweated on that bench.
Gonna do a dab of
strolling down the alley beside the Dyers. And the only thing that changed was that the tea got worse.
some wedding cake.
The wine was so
A
bad
wedding
that he
pie,
began
should I say.
drinking ale. The first day, the tavern keeper offered fish for a midday meal. The smell, they had been caught last week. The second day, he offered a stew of oysters. Matt ate 5 bowls of that, despite the bits of shell. Brigida declined both. He had been surprised when she caught up to him in Elysian, hurrying across the Mulhara that first morning. The sun barely made a rim above the rooftops, but already people in carts dotted the square.
Should I get a better look at it?
I must
It's the
have
same
missed.
stuff I just showed you,
I
but
was waiting the way I thought you'd come out. If you don't mind company. We move fast sometimes, he said evasively. Elysian looked at him sideways. Of course, he had no idea why they had crept out through a tiny side door near the stables. It was not that Matt thought Tyler would actually leap on him in the halls in broad daylight. But then again, it didn't hurt to be careful.
okay.
Your company is welcome anytime. Thanks. She just shrugged and murmured something he did not catch and fell in on the other side of him. That was the beginning of it. Any other woman he had ever known would have demanded to know thanks for what, and then explained why none were necessary at such length that he wanted to cover his ears, or upbraided him at equal length
Nice.
for thinking they were.
Yeah, mine is
But sometimes made it clear she expected something more.
wedding pie. Well, I'll show it to you as soon as I do this dab. I almost put my hand right over that torch.
Something startling occurred in his head. Normally, to him, women were to admire and smile at, to dance with and kiss if they would allow, to snuggle with if he was lucky. Deciding which women to chase was almost as fun as chasing them, if not nearly so much as catching them. Some women were just friends, of course. A few. Egwene, though he was not sure how that friendship would survive to become an honor. Nynaeve was sort of a friend, in a way. If she could forget for 1 hour that she had switched his body more than once, and remember he was not a boy anymore. But a woman friend was different from a man. You always knew her mind ran along other paths than yours, that she saw the world with different eyes. Brigida leaned toward him on the bench. "You'd best be wary," she murmured. "That widow is looking for a new husband. The sheath on her marriage knife is blue. Besides, the house is over there." At length, losing sight of the sweetly plump woman who rolled her hips so extravagantly as she walked, and Brigida answered his sheepish grin with a laugh. She would have played him with her tongue for looking, and even Egwene would have been cruelly disapproving. By the end of the second day on that bench, he realized he had sat all that time with his hands in her ears and never once thought of trying to kiss her. He was sure she would be kissed by him. Frankly, considering the dog-ugly men she seemed to enjoy looking at, he might have been insulted if she had. And she was a hero out of legend, whom he still half expected to leap over a house and grab a couple of the Forsaken by the neck on the way. But that was not it. He would as soon have thought of kissing Elysian. The same as just exactly as he liked Brigida. 2 days on that bench, up and down to trot down the alley beside the dyer and stare at the tall wall of bare brick at the back of the house. Forget it. But even she might have broken her neck if she tried wearing a dress.
Now
Free
time
he
to
decided on the
get
spur
back
of the
to
moment
this.
to follow a woman coming
The
out
last
the
of
house,
my,
too, wearing the red belt of a wise woman. Random chance did seem to
Alright.
his luck.
Not that
The
much.
wise woman
My brother, most hated, plays it more.
before going back.
I'm more into
The other walked 2 streets over
Diablo
to a big green striped
and
fish.
like
The
them
third
types
woman,
of games, fighting
tall
games.
and dark,
Give me 1
a
second.
gray wolf, maybe a tyrant, crossed 2 bridges before entering a large shop where she was greeted with smiles by a skinny bowing fellow supervising the loading of lacquered boxes and trays into sawdust-filled baskets that were then loaded into a wagon.
But I have it. I have a couple accounts for it, but
Piece of silver with them in Andor. Matt barely managed to escape the box. So much for random luck. No one else had any either. Nynaeve and Elaine and Avienda made their pilgrimages to the streets around Carden's small palace without seeing anyone they recognized, which frustrated
I've
them.
been playing a lot of
They still
Titan
refused to
Quest, Diablo
send
2,
baskets of
Diablo
people who were not
3,
seen. That was what they said,
and
showing him enough teeth for 6 women.
UFC
The
5.
grimaces were supposed to be smiles, he thought. It was a shame
But
Avienda
me
should
and
have fallen in with the other 2 so
my
thoroughly.
brother,
There was a
most
moment
hated
when he
grower,
was pressing them for an answer.
we definitely
Elaine snapped at him and
did some
stared
grinding
at
on
his
GTA 5.
woman
A
whispered
lot of
something in
grinding.
her ear.
He still has it downloaded on the system. He still plays once in a
Elaine
while.
said earnestly, her face going so red,
I just
her hair
haven't
seemed pale.
gone on in a minute, and
I humbly beg pardon for
I
speaking
needed
so.
room on my system, so I deleted it.
Will beg on my knees, if you wish. No surprise, the voice faltered at the end. No need for that, he said faintly, trying not to goggle. You're forgiven. It was nothing. The oddest thing, though, Elaine looked at Avienda the whole time she spoke to him, and did not twitch an eyelid when he replied. But heaved a great sigh of relief when Avienda nodded. Women were just strange. Tom reported that Carden gave to beggars frequently, and aside from that, every scrap word about him in the Vidar was the kind to be expected, depending on whether the speaker thought white cloaks were murderous monsters or the true saviors of the world. Julian learned that Carden had purchased a plan of the Tarasan Palace, which might indicate some white cloak intention toward Vidar. It might indicate that Pedro Nile
No shit, hell yeah.
for himself and intended to if he still lived. Rumors had sprung up in the city that he was dead, but then half said Aes Sedai had killed him, and half said Rand had, which showed their worth. Neither Julian or Tom had scuffed up a pebble concerning a white-haired old man with a much-worn face. Frustration with Carden, frustration with watching the bloody house, and as far as the palace went. Matt found out how things were to go that first night when he finally got back to his rooms. Oliver was there, already fed and curled up in a chair with the travels of J.M. Farstrider by the light of the stand lamps, and not at all upset over being moved out of his own room. Vedic had been as good as his word. As good as the gold he stuffed in his pouch, anyway. The sulking room now held Oliver's bed. Just let Tynan try anything with a child watching her. The Queen had not been idle either, though. He sneaked down to the kitchens like a fox, slipping from corner to corner, flashing down the stairs, and found there was no food to be had. Oh, the smell of cooking permeated the air. Roasts turning on spits in the big fireplaces, pots bubbling atop the white tiled stoves, and cooks kept popping open ovens to prod this or that. There was just no food for Matt Coffin. Smiling women in pristine white aprons ignored his own smiles and put themselves in his way, so he could not get near the sources of those wonderful smells. They smiled and rapped his knuckles when he tried to snatch a loaf of bread or just a bit of honey-glazed turnip. They smiled and told him he must not spoil his appetite if he was to eat with the Queen. They knew. Every last one of them knew. His own blushes, as much as anything else, drove him out of his room, bitterly regretting that odorous fish at midday. He locked the door behind him. A woman who would
The one I ended up burning out was
he was lying on a green
Red Dead 2.
Snakes and foxes with Oliver.
Because I got the
The
add-in.
second note was slipped under his
I
door.
grinded the shit out of it.
I have been told it is more sporting to take a pigeon.
Completed the story.
Watch it flutter. But sooner or later,
Did all kind of shit on the story mode.
will fly to pad.
Started playing online mode, and
What is it, Matt? Oliver asked.
yeah, it just went from there.
Matt crumpled the note. Another game? Oh, yes. The boy would play the fool game all
And
day.
I've been playing a lot more RPGs
Matt, did you
lately.
try any of that ham they cooked tonight? I never tasted anything. Just throw the dice, Oliver. Just throw the bloody dice. Coming back from
Right, the fishing one was pretty good.
Bread and olives and used milk cheese on the
If
way,
other
which was just as well.
online players that annoy me,
Still had its orders.
I'd
Bloody women actually
lasso them up, hog tie him, and either throw them in front of tracks or
just beyond his reach until the meat
feed 'em to
spoiled his
alligators.
bloody appetite.
or drown them.
He maintained his dignity. He did not grab.
Because I had the reinforced
He made his
rope,
finest
so
leg, flourishing
it's a little bit harder to break out of.
Gracious ladies, your warmth and hospitality overwhelmed me. His withdrawal would have gone a deal better if one of the cooks had not cackled at his back. The queen will feast on roast ducklings soon enough, lad. Very droll. The other women roared so hard they must have been rolling on the floor. Very bloody droll. Bread and olives and salty cheese made a fine meal, with a little water from his washstand to wash it down. There had not been any wine punch in his room since that first day. Oliver tried to tell him about some sort of roasted fish with mustard sauce and raisins. Matt told him to practice his reading. Nobody slipped a note under his door that night. Nobody rattled the lock. He began to think things might turn for the better. Tomorrow was the Festival of Birds. From what he had heard of the costumes some people wore, men and women both, it might be possible Tylen would find herself a new duckling to chase after. Somebody might come out of that bloody house across from the Rose of the Yell Bar and hand him the bloody Bull of the Winds. Things just had to turn for the better. When he woke for his tired third morning in the Tarson Palace, the dice were rolling in his head. Chapter 29. The Festival of Birds.
Teeth are
Waking to
hurting.
the dice, Matt considered going back to sleep until they went away. But at last he got up feeling grumpy. As if he did not have more than enough on his plate already. He chased Narum away and dressed himself, eating the last of the bread and cheese from the night before while he did, then went to check on Oliver. The boy flashed between bursts of yanking on his clothes in a hurry to be out and stopping entirely with boot or shirt in hand, to spout dozens of questions that Matt answered with half a mind. No, they would not go racing today, and never mind the rich races at the Circuit of Heaven north of the city. Maybe they could go see the menagerie. Yes, Matt would buy him a feathered mask for the festival, if he ever got dressed. That sent him into a flurry. What really occupied Matt's thoughts were those bloody dice. Why had they started up again? He still did not know how they had before. When Oliver was finally clothed, he followed Matt into the sitting room, bubbling with half-heard questions, and bumped him from behind when he stopped dead. Tylen replaced the book Oliver had been reading the night before on the table. Majesty! Matt's eyes darted to the door he had locked last night, now standing wide open. What a surprise! He pulled Oliver around in front of him, between him and the woman's mocking smile. Well, maybe it was not really mocking, but it surely seemed so right then. She was certainly pleased with herself. I was about to take Oliver out to see the festival and some traveling menagerie. He wants a feathered mask. He snapped his mouth shut to stop babbling and started edging toward the door, using the boy as a shield. Yes, Tylen murmured, watching through her eyelashes. She made no move to intervene, but her smile deepened, as if she was just waiting for his foot to land in the snare. Much better if he has a companion instead of running with the urchins, as I hear he does. One hears a good deal about your lad. Rizella? A woman appeared in the doorway, and Matt gave a start. A fanciful mask of swirling blue and golden feathers hid most of Rosella's face, but the feathers on the rest of her costume did not hide very much else. She possessed the most spectacular bosom he had ever seen. Oliver, she said, sinking to her knees, would you like to walk out with me at festival? She held up a mask like a red and green hawk, just the right size for a boy. Before Matt could open his mouth, Oliver broke free and rushed. Oh, yes, please. Thank you. The ungrateful little lout laughed as she tied the hawk mask on his face and hugged him to her bosom. Hand in hand, they ran out, leaving Matt gaping. He recovered himself quickly enough when Tylen said, Well, for you, I am not a jealous woman, my sweet. She produced the long iron key to his door from behind her gold and silver belt, and then another just like it, waggling the peg. People always keep keys in a box near the door. That was where he had left his. And no one ever thinks there might be a second key. One key went back behind her belt. The other was turned in the lock with a loud click before joining its fellow. Now, Lamb, she smiled. It was too much. The woman hounded him, tried to starve him. Now she locked them in together like he did not know what. Lambkin? Those bloody dice were bouncing around in his skull. Besides, he had important business to see to. The dice had never had anything to do with finding something, but he reached her in two long strides, seized her arm, and began fumbling in her belt for the keys. I don't have bloody time for it. His breath froze as the sharp point of her dagger beneath his chin shut his mouth and drove him right up onto his toes. Remove your hand, she said coldly. He managed to look down his nose at her face. She was not smiling now. He let go of her arm carefully. She did not lessen the pressure of her blade, though. She shook her head. I do try to make allowances for you being an outlander, Gosling. But since you wish to play roughly, hands at your sides. Move. The knife point gave a direction. He shuffled backward on tiptoe rather than have his neck sliced. What are you going to do? He mumbled through his teeth. A stretched neck put a strain in his voice. A stretched neck, among other things. Well, he could try grabbing her wrist. He was quick with his hands. What are you going to do? Quick enough with the knife already at his throat. That was the question. That, and the one he asked her. If she intended to kill him, a shove of her wrist right there would drive the dagger straight up into his brain. Will you answer me? That was not panic in his voice. He was not in panic. Majesty? Tylen? Well, maybe he was in a bit of a panic, to use her name. You could call any woman in Ebu Dar duckling or pudding all day, and she would smile. But use her name before she said you could, and you found a hotter reception than you would for goosing a strange woman on the street anywhere else. A few kisses exchanged were never enough for permission either. Tylen did not answer, only kept him tiptoeing backward until suddenly his shoulders bumped against something that stopped him. With that flaming dagger never easing a hair, he could not move his head. But his eyes, that had been focused on her face, darted. They were in the bedchamber, a flower-carved red bedpost hard between his shoulder blades. Why would she bring him? His face was suddenly as crimson as the bedpost. No, she could not mean to. It was not decent. It was not possible. You can't do this to me, he mumbled at her. And if his voice was a touch breathy and shrill, he surely had cause. Watch and learn, my kitten, Tylan said, and drew her marriage knife. Afterward, a considerable time later, he irritably pulled the sheet up to his chest. A silk sheet, Nilesian had been right. The Queen of Altara hummed happily beside the bed, arms twisted behind her to do up the buttons of her dress. All he had on was the fox-head medallion on its cord, much good that had done, and the black scarf tied around his neck. A ribbon on her present, the bloody woman called it. He rolled over and snatched his silver-mounted pipe and tobacco pouch from the small table on the other side from her. Golden tongs and a hot coal and a golden bowl of sand provided the means for lighting. Folding his arms, he puffed away as fiercely as he frowned.
All right, Massey. Definitely appreciate it. Whoever smashed that light.
She yanked her dagger from where it was
Do
driven
another
into the
dab.
bedpost beside her marriage knife, examining the point before sheathing it. What is the matter? You know you enjoyed yourself as much as I did. And I... She laughed suddenly, and oh so much, sheathing the marriage knife as well. If that is part of the game to your things, you must be very popular. Matt flushed like fun.
I'll be glad when I get some
It
razors.
isn't natural, he burst
I
out.
can actually fucking shave. This shit itches
I'm the
already.
one who's supposed to do the chasing. Her astonished eyes surely mirrored his own. Had Tylan been a tavern maid who smiled the right way, he might have tried his luck. Rather than a tavern maid like the sun who liked poking holes in the ground. But he was the one who chased. He had just never thought of it that way before. He had never had the need to before. Tylan began laughing, shaking her head and wiping at her eyes with her fingers. Oh, pigeon. I do keep forgetting.
Yeah, 'cause this right here is the longest that I've had it.
I left a little present for you in the sitting room. She patted his foot through the sheet. Eat well today. You are going to need...
Oh, that's what I was doing too.
Matt put a hand over his eyes and tried
Gotta
to
let it cool down a little bit though.
When he uncovered them, she was gone. Climbing out of the bed, he tucked the sheet around him. For some reason, the notion of walking around bare felt uncomfortable. The bloody woman might leap out of the wardrobe. Why bother with laces? You could just cut somebody's clothes off. She had no
No, it's not that. It's just
enjoyed peeling him.
I don't have any razors right now.
Not quite holding his breath, he pulled open the tall red and gilt wardrobe. She was not hiding inside.
I gotta wait for my my check to get in on the first for me to be able to get
Dressing
it.
quickly, he chose a plain coat of dark bronze silk, then stuck the sliced rags each until he could dispose of them without Narum seeing. Or anyone else for that.
I forgot to check
Too many people
if I
already
needed any
entirely
before
towards what was going on between
I ran
them.
out of money for the month.
There was no way he could face anybody knowing this. In the sitting room, he lifted the lid of the lacquerware box by the door, then let it fall with a sigh. He had not really expected Tylan to replace the key. He leaned against the door. The unlocked door. Like, what was he going to do?
But since
Innkeeper wherever he went.
since I was a kid, I've always
Nynaeve and Elaine to claim he had broken some
kept
agreement
it
to put an end to their promises.
all of it shaved.
Burn all women. A large parcel, elaborately wrapped in green paper, sat on one of the tables. It contained an eagle mask in black and gold, and a coat covered with...
Hell yeah, Bessie.
There was also a red silk purse holding 20 gold crowns, and a note that smelled of flowers. I would have bought you an earring, Piglet, but I noticed your ear is not pierced. Have it done, and buy yourself something nice. He nearly wept again. He gave women presents. The world was standing on its head. Piglet? Oh, light. After a minute, he did take the mask. She owed him that much, for his coat alone. When he finally reached the small, shaded courtyard, where they had been meeting each morning beside a tiny round pool of lily pads and brightly spotted white fish, he found Elysian and Brigitte ready for the Festival of Birds, too. The tyrant had contented himself with a plain green mask, but Brigitte's was a spray of yellow and red with a crest of plumes. Her golden hair hung loose, with feathers tied all down its length, and she wore a dress with a wide yellow belt, diaphanous beneath more red and yellow feathers. It did not reveal nearly as much as Rosella's, yet it seemed about to every time she moved. He had never thought of her wearing a dress like other women. "Sometimes it's fun to be looked at," she said, poking him in the ribs when he commented. Her grin would have done for Elysian, saying how much fun it was to pinch serving girls. "There's a lot more to it than feather dancers wore, but not enough to slow me down. And anyway, I cannot see we'll have to move quickly on this side of the river." The dice rattled in his head. "What kept you?" she went on. "You didn't make us wait till you could tickle a pretty girl, I hope." He hoped he was not blushing. I was not certain what excuse he would have made, but just then, half a dozen men wearing feathered coats strolled into the courtyard, all with those narrow swords on their hips, all but one wearing an elaborate mask with colorful crest and beak that represented no bird ever seen by human eyes. The exception was Beslin, twirling his mask by its ribbon. "Oh, blood and bloody ashes, what's he doing here?" "Beslin?" Elysian folded his hands in the pommel of his sword and shook his head in disbelief. "Why, burn my soul, he says he intends to spend the festival in your company. Some promise you two made, he says. I told him it would be deadly boring, but he wouldn't believe me." "I cannot think it is ever boring around Matt," Hyland's son said. His bow took them all in, but his dark eyes especially lingered on Brigitte. "I've never had so much fun as I did drinking with him in Lady Elaine's water on Swoban night. The truth, I remember little. He did not seem to recognize that water. Strangely, considering the taste she had shown in men, Beslin was fine-looking, maybe a little too fine, not at all her sort. Strangely, she smiled slightly and grinned under his scrutiny. Right then, Matt did not care how out of character she behaved. Obviously, Beslin suspected nothing, or that sort of his likely would already be out, but the last thing under the light Matt wanted was a day in company with the man. It would be excruciating. He had some sense of decency, even if Beslin's mother did not. The only problem was Beslin, who took that bloody promise to attend all the festivals and feast days together very seriously. The more Matt agreed with Elysian that the day they had planned would be dull beyond belief, the more determined Beslin grew. After a bit, his face began to darken, and Matt began to think that sword might be unsheathed yet. Well, a promise was a promise. When he and Elysian and Brigitte left the palace, half a dozen feathered fools strutted along. Matt was sure it would not have happened had Brigitte been wearing her proper clothes. The whole lot of them kept eyeing her and smiling. "What was all that twisting around while he was spilling his eyes all over you?" he muttered as they crossed the Malhara. He tugged the ribbon holding the eagle mask tighter. "I did not twist, I moved." Her primness was so blatantly false, he would have laughed some other time. "Slightly." Abruptly, her grin was back, and she lowered her voice for his ear alone. "I told you, sometimes it's fun to be looked at. Just because they're all too pretty doesn't mean I cannot enjoy them looking." "Oh, you'll want to look at her," she added, pointing to a slender woman who went running by in a blue owl mask and rather fewer feathers than Rosella had worn. That was one of the things about Brigitte. She would nudge him in the ribs and point out a pretty girl for his eyes readily as any man he had ever known, and expect him to point out in turn what she liked to see, which was generally the ugliest man in sight. Whether or not she chose to go half naked today, a quarter anyway, she was, well, a friend. A strange world it was turning out to be. One woman he was beginning to think of as a drinking companion, and another after him as intently as he would pursue any pretty memories or his own. More intently, he had never chased any woman who let him know she did not want to be chased. A very strange world. The sun stood little more than halfway to its peak, but already celebrants filled the streets and squares and bridges. Tumblers and jugglers and musicians with feathers sewn about their clothes performed at every street corner, the music often drowned in laughter and shouting. For the poorer folk, a few feathers laced into their hair sufficed. Pigeon feathers gathered from the pavement for the street children dodging about and the beggars. But masks and costumes grew more elaborate as purses grew heavier. More elaborate and frequently more scandalous. Men and women alike were often decked in feathers that revealed more skin than Rosella or that woman back in the Malhara. No commerce moved in the streets or canals today, though a number of shops seemed to be opened, along with every tavern and inn, of course. But here and there a wagon made its way through the throng, or a barge was pulled along supporting a platform where young women and men posed in bright bird masks that covered their entire heads, with spreading crests sometimes rising a full pace, moving long, colorful wings in such a way that the rest of their costumes were exposed only in flashes, which was just as well, considering. According to Beslin, these settings, as they were called, were usually presented in guild halls and private palaces and houses. The entire festival normally took place indoors for the most part. It did not snow properly in Ebudar, even when the weather was as it should be. Beslin said he would like to see this snow one day. But apparently, ordinary winter was cold enough to keep people from running around outdoors or behind clothes. With the heat, everything was spilling into the streets. More than for nightfall, Beslin said. Then Matt would really see something. And if sunlight faded, so did inhibitions. Staring at a tall, slender woman gliding along through the crowd in masked and feathered cloak, and beyond that, 6 or 7 feathers, Matt wondered what inhibitions some of these folk had left to shed. He almost shouted at her to cover herself with that cloak. She was pretty, but out in the street, before the light and everybody. Those wagons carrying the settings attracted followers, of course. Thick knots of men and women who shouted and laughed as they tossed coins, and sometimes folded notes onto the wagons and squeezed everyone else in the street aside. He became used to fleeing ahead down a crossing street, or waiting until the setting went by on some section of bridge. While waiting, Brigitte and Elysian tossed coins to filthy urchins and dirtier beggars. Well, Elysian tossed. Brigitte concentrated on the children and pressed each coin into a grubby hand like a gift. In one of those waits, Beslin suddenly put a hand on Elysian's arm, raising his voice above the crowd, coming from at least 6 different places. "Forgive me, Tyron, but not him." The ragged man edged back into the throng, warily. Gaunt-cheeked and bony, he seemed to have lost whatever pitiful feathers. "Why not?" Elysian demanded. "No brass ring on his little finger," Beslin replied. "He's not in the guild." "Light," Matt said. "The man can't even beg in this city without belonging to a guild." Maybe it was his tone. The beggar leaped for his throat, a knife appearing in his grimy fist. Without thinking, Matt grabbed the man's arm and spun, slinging him away into the crowd. Some people cursed at Matt, some at the sprawling beggar. Some tossed the fellow a coin. From the corner of his eye, Matt saw a second skinny man in rags try to push Brigitte out of the way to reach him with a long knife. It was a foolish mistake to underestimate the woman because of her costume. From somewhere among those feathers, she produced a knife and stabbed him beneath the arm. "Look out!" Matt shouted at her, but there was no time for it. Even as he shouted, he drew from his coat sleeve and threw sidearmed. The blade streaked past her face to sink into the throat of yet another beggar flaunting steel before it could plant it in her ribs. Suddenly, there were beggars everywhere with knives and clubs studded with spikes. Screams and shouts rose as people in masks and costumes scrambled to get out of the way. Elysian slashed a man in rags across the face, sending him reeling. Beslin ran another through the middle, while his costumed cronies fought still others. Matt had no time to see more. He found himself back to back with Brigida and facing his own adversaries. He could feel her shifting against him, hear her mutter curses, but he was barely conscious of it. Brigida could take care of herself. Watching the two men in front of him, he was not sure he could do the same. The hulking fellow with the toothless sneer had only one arm and a puckered socket where his left eye had been, but his fist held a club 2 feet long, encircled by iron bands that sprouted spikes like steel thorns. His rat-faced little companion still had both eyes and several teeth, and despite sunken cheeks and arms that seemed all bone and sinew, he moved like a snake, licking his lips and flicking a rusty dagger from hand to hand. Matt aimed the shorter knife in his own hand, first one, then the other. It was still long enough to reach a man's vitals. They danced and shuffled, each waiting for the other to leap at him first. "Old Cully won't like this spar," the bigger man growled. Rat-face darted forward, a rusty blade flashing from hand to hand. He did not step the knife that suddenly appeared in Matt's left hand and sliced across his wrist. The dagger clattered to the paving stones, but the fellow flung himself at Matt anyway. As Matt's other blade stabbed into his chest, he squealed, eyes going wide, arms wrapping around Matt convulsively. The bald fellow's sneer widened, his club rising as he stepped in. The grin vanished as two beggars swarmed over him, snarling and stabbing. Staring incredulously, Matt shoved Ratface's corpse away. The street was clear for 50 paces except for combatants, and everywhere beggars rolled on the pavement, 2 or 3 or sometimes 4 stabbing at one, beating him with clubs or rocks. Beslin caught Matt's arm. There was blood on his face, but he was grinning. "Let's get out of here and let the Fellowship of Alms finish its business. There's no honor in fighting beggars, and besides, the guild won't leave any of these interlopers alive. Follow me." Nelesian was scowling. Doubtless he saw no honor in fighting beggars either, and Beslin's friends, several with their costumes awry, and one with his mask off so another could dab at a cut across his forehead. The man with the cut was grinning too. Brigida bore not a scratch that Matt could see, and her costume looked as neat as it had back in the palace. She made her knife disappear. There was no way she could hide a blade under those feathers, but she did. Matt made no protest at being drawn away, but he did growl, "Do beggars always go around attacking people in this city?" Beslin might not appreciate hearing it called a bloody city. The man laughed. "You are Taviran, Matt. There's always excitement around Taviran." Matt smiled back with gritted teeth. Bloody fool, bloody city, and bloody Taviran. Well, if a beggar slit his throat, he would not have to go back to the palace and let Tylan peel him like a ripe pear. Come to think of it, she had called him her little pear. Bloody everything! The street between the dyer's shop and the rows of the ale bar had its share of revelers, though not many scantily clad. Apparently you had to have coin to go near naked. Though the acrobats in front of the merchant's house on the corner came close, the men barefoot and bare-chested in tight, brightly colored breeches, the women in even tighter breeches and thin blouses. They all had a few feathers in their hair, as did the capering musicians playing in front of the small palace at the far corner. A woman with a flute, another blowing on a tall, twisted black tube covered with levers, and a fellow beating a timbre for all he was worth. The house they had come to watch looked shut up tight. The tea at the Rose was as bad as ever, which meant it was much better than the wine. Elysian stuck to the sour local ale. Brigida said thanks without saying for what, and Matt shrugged it off silently. They grinned at each other and tapped cups. The sun rose, and Beslin sat balancing first one boot on the toe of the other, then the other way around. But his companions began growing restive, no matter how often he pointed out that Matt was Taviran. A scuffle with beggars was hardly proper excitement. The street was too narrow for any settings to pass. The women were not as pretty as elsewhere, and even looking at Brigida seemed to pall once they realized that she did not intend to kiss even one of them. With protestations of regret that Beslin would not come, they hurried off to find somewhere more exhilarating. Elysian took a stroll down the alley beside the dyers, and Brigida vanished into the Rose's murky interior to find, she said, whether there was anything at all fit to drink hidden in some forgotten corner. I never expected to see a water guard like that, Veslin said, changing his boots around. Matt blinked. The fellow had sharp eyes. She had not removed her mask once. Well, as long as he did not know about it. I think you'll be good for my mother, Matt. Choking, Matt sprayed tea into the passers-by. Several glared at him angrily, and one slender woman with a nice little bosom gave him a coy smile from beneath the blue mask he thought was meant to be a wren. She stamped a foot and stalked off when he did not smile back. Luckily, no one was angry enough to take it beyond glares before they too went on their way. Or maybe unluckily. He would not have minded if 6 or 8 piled on him right then. What do you mean? He said hoarsely. Veslin's head whipped around in wide-eyed surprise. Why, her choosing you for her pretty, of course. Why is your face so red? Are you angry? Why? Suddenly he slapped his forehead and laughed. You think I will be angry? Forgive me. I forget you're an outlander. Matt, she's my mother, not my wife. Father died 10 years ago, and she has always claimed to be too busy. I'm just glad she chose someone I like. Where are you going? He did not realize he was on his feet until Veslin spoke. I just need to clear my head. But you're drinking tea, Matt. Dodging around a green sedan chair, he half saw the door of the house open, and a woman with a blue feathered cloak over her dress slip out. Unthinkingly, his head was spinning too much to think clearly, he fell in behind her. Veslin knew. He approved. His own mother, and he... Matt, Elysian shouted behind him, where are you going? If I'm not back by tomorrow, Matt shouted back absently over his shoulder. Tell them they'll have to find it for themselves. He walked down after the woman in a daze, not hearing if Elysian or Veslin shouted again. The man knew. He remembered once thinking that Veslin and his mother were both. They were worse. All of every dog was mad. He was hardly aware of the fingers still spinning inside his skull.
From a window of the meeting room, Rihanna watched Solane disappear down the street toward the river. Some fellow in a bronze coat followed in her wake, but if he tried to impede her, he would find out soon enough that Solane had no time for men, and no patience with them. Rihanna was not sure why the urge had grown so strong today. For days it had come on almost with the morning and faded with the sun, and for days she had fought. By the strict rules they did not quite dare call laws, that order was given at the half moon, still 6 nights off. But today, she had spoken the order before she thought, and been unable to make herself retract until the proper time. It would be well. No one had seen any sign of those 2 young fools calling themselves lame and naive anywhere in the world. Thank the light, there had been no need to take dangerous risks. Sighing, she turned to the others, who waited until she took her chair before seating themselves. It would be well, as it always had been. Secrets would be kept, as they always had been. But still, there was no touch of foretelling or anything of that sort, yet perhaps that overwhelming urge had been telling her something. 12 women watched her expectantly. I think we should consider moving everyone who does not wear the belt to the farm for a little while. There was little discussion. They were the elders, but she was the eldest. In that, at least, there was no harm in behaving as I did. Chapter 30. The First Cup. I do not understand this, Elaine protested. She had not been offered a chair. In fact, when she started to sit, she'd been told curtly to remain standing. 5 sets of eyes were focused on her, 5 women with set, grim faces. You are behaving as if we've done something terrible, when what we have done is find the bowl of the winds. At least they were on the brink of it, she hoped. The message Nelisian had come back with was none too clear. Matt had gone off shouting that he had found it, or something very like. No, the longer he talked, the more he bounced between absolute certainty and doubt. Brigitte had remained watching Rihanna's house. She seemed to be sweaty and bored. In any case, matters were in motion. Elaine wondered how Nynaeve was getting on. Better than herself, she hoped. She had certainly never expected this when she revealed their success. You have endangered a secret kept close by every woman to wear the shawl for over 2,000 years. Marillilla sat stiff-backed, serenity almost abandoned, on the tight-lipped brink of apoplexy. You must have been insane. Only madness could excuse this. What secret? Elaine demanded. Vandine, flanking Marillilla with her sister, pale green silk skirts irritably and said, Time enough for that when you've been pregnant, child. I thought you had some sense. Adelius, in a dark gray wool with deep brown trim, mirroring Vandine's disapproval. The child cannot be faulted for revealing a secret. Cariana Francie said from Elaine's left, shifting her bulk in her green and gilt armchair. She was not stout, but almost, with shoulders as wide and arms as thick as most men. Tower law does not allow for excuses, Saritha put in quickly, in somewhat self-important tones, her normally inquisitive brown eyes stern. Once mere excuses are allowed, inevitably lesser and lesser excuses will become acceptable until law itself is gone. Her high-backed chair stood to the right. Only she wore her shawl, but Marililla's sitting room had been arranged as a court, though no one called it that. So far, no one had.
Hey, Bastard, how you doing, bro?
Adelius and Vandine confronted Elaine like judges. Saritha's chair was placed where the seat of rebuke would be, and Cariana's the seat of pardon. But the Damani Green, who would have been her defender, nodded thoughtfully.
We're doing another
and
dab.
Tyron Brown, who would have been thoughtfully, continued. She has admitted guilt from her own mouth. I recommend that the child be confined to the palace until we leave, with some good hard work to occupy her mind and her hands. I also recommend a firm dose of the slipper at regular intervals to remind her not to go behind Sister's back. And the same for Nynaeve, as soon as she can be found. Elaine swallowed. Fine. Perhaps they did not need to name this a trial for it to be one. Saritha might not yet have achieved the ageless face, but the weight of the argument was pressed at Elaine. Adelius and Vandine, with their hair nearly all white, even their ageless faces echoing years. Marililla's hair was blonde. Elaine would not have been surprised to learn that she wore the shawl as long or longer than most women not Aes Sedai lived. For that matter, Cariana might have as well. Not one of them approached her own strength and power, but all that experience as Aes Sedai, all that knowledge, all that authority. A heavy reminder that she was only 18 and had been in Novice White a year ago. Cariana made no move to rebut Saritha's suggestions. Perhaps she best go on defending herself. Plainly, this secret you speak of has something to do with the Circle, but the kin are no concern of yours, child. Marillilla broke in sharply. Drawing a deep breath, she smoothed gold-slashed skirts of silvery gray. I propose to pass sentence, she said in a cold voice. I concur and defer to your decision, Adelius said. She gave Elaine a disappointed frown and shook her head. Raised her hand dismissively. I concur and defer, but I agree with the seat of rebuke. Elena's look might have contained sympathy, maybe a slither. Marillilla opened her mouth. It sounded quite loud in the momentary thunderous silence. What under the light? Marillilla muttered angrily. I told Paul not to let anyone disturb us. Cariana? Not the youngest, but the lowest in strength, Cariana stood and glided to the door. Despite her heft, She always moved like a swan. It was Paul herself, Marililla's maid, who popped in curtsying left and right. A slender, gray-haired woman, usually possessed of a dignity to rival that of her mistress, she wore an anxious frown now, as well she might, barging in after Marililla's instructions. Elaine had not been so glad to see anyone since Matt Cawthon appeared in the Stone of Tyr, a horrendous thought. If Avienda did not say she had met Toh sufficiently soon, she might just see if asking the man to beat her after all could end the agony. "The Queen brought this herself," Paul announced breathily, proffering a letter sealed with a large red lump of wax. "She said if I didn't give it to Elaine right away, she'd bring it in herself. She said it's about the child's mother." Elaine almost ground her teeth. The sisters' serving women had all picked up their mistress's way of talking about Nynaeve and her, if seldom where they could hear. Furious, she snatched the letter without waiting for Marililla to say she could, if that was what she would have said, and broke the seal with her thumb. "My Lady Elaine, I greet the daughter heir of Andor with joyous news. I have but just learned that your mother, Queen Morghese, lives, and is at present the guest of Padron Nile and Amador, and wishes above all to be reunited with you, so that you may return to Andor together in triumph. I offer escort through the bandits now infesting Altara, so that you may reach your mother's side in safety and all speed. Forgive these few poor words, scribbled in haste, but I know you would wish to learn the wondrous news as soon as possible. Until I can leave you at your mother's side. Sealed in the light, Jaqen Caridin." The paper crumpled in her fist. How dare he? The pain of her mother's death, without even a body to be buried, was only beginning to fade, and Caridin dared mock her this way? Embracing the true source, she hurled the foul lies away from her and channeled. Fire flared in midair, so hot that only a dust of ash fell to the blue and gold floor tiles. That for Jaqen Caridin! And as for these women, the pride of 1,000 years of Andoran queens put steel into her backbone. Marililla surged to her feet. "You were not given permission to channel. You will release the—" "Leave us, Paul," Elaine said. "Now." The serving woman stared, but Elaine's mother had taught her well the voice of command, the voice of a queen from her throne. Paul bobbed a curtsy and was moving before she realized. Once underway, she hesitated only an instant before hurrying out and closing the door behind her. Whatever was about to happen, plainly, was for Aes Sedai alone. "What has gotten into you, child?" Pure fury submerged the remnants of Marililla's regathered calm. "Release the source immediately, or I vow I'll fetch a slipper myself this minute." "I am Aes Sedai." The words came out like winter stone, and Elaine meant them to. Caridin's lies, and these women. Marililla threatened to slipper her? They would acknowledge her rightful place as a sister. She and Nynaeve had found the bowl, as good as anyway, and the arrangements for its use were underway. "You propose to punish me for endangering a secret apparently known only to sisters, but no one bothered to tell me this secret when I attained the shawl. You suggest punishing me like a novice or accepted, but I am Aes Sedai. I was raised to the shawl by Egwene Alvear, the Amerlin you claim to serve. If you deny that Nynaeve and I are Aes Sedai, then you deny the Amerlin seat who sent me to find the Bowl of the Winds, which we have done. I will not have it. I call you to account, Marililla Siandevan. Submit to the will of the Amerlin seat, or I will call judgment on you as a rebellious traitor." Marililla's eyes bulged, and her mouth hung open, but she appeared composed beside Cariana or Saritha, who looked about to choke to death on incredulity. Vandene seemed mildly taken aback. A thoughtful finger pressed to her lips beneath slightly widened eyes, while Adelia sat forward, studying Elaine as if seeing her for the first time. Channeling, Elaine floated one of the tall armchairs to her and sat, composing her skirts. You may as well sit too, Marililla. She still used the voice of command. Apparently it was the only way to make them listen. But she was startled when Marililla actually sank back down slowly, staring at her pop-eyed. Outside, she maintained a calm, cool facade, but inside, anger bubbled. No, it boiled. Secrets. She'd always thought Aes Sedai kept too many secrets, even from each other, especially from each other. True, she kept some herself, but only at necessity, and not from anyone who needed to know. And these women had fought to punish her. Your authority comes from the hall of the tower, Marililla. Nynaeve and mine from the Amyrlin seat. Ours supersedes yours. From now on, you will take your instructions from Nynaeve or me. We will, of course, listen carefully to any advice you might offer. She had thought Marililla's eyes bulged before, but now... Impossible, the Grey spluttered. You are Marililla, Elaine said sharply, leaning forward. Do you still deny the authority of your Amyrlin? Do you still dare? Marililla's mouth worked soundlessly. She wet her lips. She shook her head jerkily. Elaine felt a thrill of exultation. All that about Marililla taking direction was stuff and nonsense, of course, but she would be acknowledged. Tom and her mother both said you must begin by asking for 10 to get 1. Still, that was not enough to damp her anger. She had half a mind to fetch a slipper herself and see how far she could push this. Except that would shatter everything. They would remember her age fast enough then, and how short a time ago she had put off a novice dress. They might even begin thinking of her as a foolish child again, which thought stoked her fury anew. But she contented herself with, while you think quietly on what else I should be told as Aes Sedai, Marililla, Adeleus and Vandene will instruct me in this secret I endangered. Do you mean to tell me the tower has known of the circle, these kin, as you call them, poor Rihanna, and her hopes to avoid Aes Sedai notice? As near as they could make themselves come to sisters, I suppose, Vandene replied, carefully. She studied Elaine as intently as her sister did now. Though a green, she had many of the same mannerisms as Adeleus. Cariana and Saritha looked stunned, disbelieving eyes swinging from a silent, red-cheeked Marililla to Elaine and back. Even during the Trolloc Wars, women failed their tests, or lacked the strength, or were sent away from the tower for any of the usual reasons. Adeleus had adopted a lecturing tone, but not offensively. Browns often did when expounding. Under the circumstances, it is hardly surprising that a number feared to go off into the world alone, nor that they might flee to Barashta, as the city that existed here then was called. Though the main part of Barashta was, of course, where the Rahad now stands. Not that a stone of Barashta remains. The Trolloc Wars did not truly envelop Iharon until late, but in the end, Barashta fell as completely as Barcine, or Shamal, or the kin, Vandene broke in gently. Adeleus blinked at her, then nodded. The kin persisted even after Barashta fell, in the same way they had before, taking in Wilders and women put out of the tower. Elaine frowned. Mistress Anan had said the kin took in Wilders too, but Rihanna's biggest anxiety had seemed to be making her and Nynaeve prove they were not. None ever remained long, Adeleus added. 5 years, perhaps 10. Then, I suppose, as now. Once they realize that their little group is no replacement for the White Tower, they go off and become village healers or wisdoms or the like, or sometimes simply forget the power, stop channeling and take up a craft or trade. In any case, they vanish, so to speak. Elaine wondered how anyone could forget the one power that way. The urge to channel, the temptation of the source, was always there, once you learned how. Aes Sedai did seem to believe some women could just put it behind them, though, once they found out they would not be Aes Sedai. Van Dien took up the explanation again. The sisters frequently spoke almost in alternating sentences, each carrying on smoothly where the other left off. The tower has known of the kin from nearly the beginning, perhaps from the very beginning. At first, no doubt, the wars took precedence, and despite calling themselves the kin, they have done just what we want such women to do. They remain hidden. Even the fact that they can channel, draw no attention whatsoever to themselves. Over the years, they've even passed on secretly, of course, carefully, when one of them found a woman falsely claiming the shawl. You said something? Elaine shook her head. Cariana, is there any tea in that pot? Cariana gave a small start. I think Adelius and Van Dien might like to wet their throats. The Damani woman did not quite look at a still staring Marililla before going to the table where the silver teapot and cups were. That doesn't explain why, Elaine went on. Why is knowledge of them such a deep secret? Why haven't they been scattered long ago? Why, the runaways, of course. Adelius made it sound the most obvious thing in the world. It is a fact that other gatherings have been broken up as soon as found, the last about 200 years ago, but the kin do keep themselves small and quiet. That last group called themselves the Daughters of Silence, yet they were hardly silent. Only 23 of them altogether, Wilders gathered and trained after a fashion by a pair of former accepted, but they... Runaways, Elaine prompted, taking a cup from Cariana with a smile of thanks. She had not asked one for herself, but she realized absently that the woman had offered her the first. Van Dien and her sister had talked quite a bit about runaways on the way to Abu Dar. Adelius blinked and pulled herself back to the topic. The kin help runaways. They always have 2 or 3 women in Tar Valon keeping watch. For one thing, they approach almost every woman put out in a very circumspect way, and for another, they manage to find every runaway, whether novice or accepted. At least none has made it off the island without their help since the Trolloc Wars. Oh yes, Van Dien said as Adelius paused to take a cup from Cariana. It had been offered to Marililla first, but Marililla sat slumped and staring bleakly at nothing. If anyone does manage to escape, why, we know right where to look, and she nearly always ends up back in the tower wishing her feet had never itched. As long as the kin don't know we know. Once that happens, it will be back to the days before the kin, when a woman running from the tower might go in any direction. The numbers were larger then. Aes Sedai, accepted, novices and runaways. And some years, 2 out of 3 escaped clean. Others, 3 out of 4. Using the kin, we take at least 9 of 10. You can see why the tower has preserved the kin and their secret like precious jewels. Elaine could. A woman was not done with the White Tower until it was done with her. Besides, it could not hurt the tower's reputation for infallibility that it always caught runaways. Almost always. Well, now she knew. She stood, and to her astonishment, Adelius did also.
Let's
and
do
Van
one more
Dien,
dab.
waving away Cariana's offered tea, and Saritha. Even Marililla, after a moment. They all looked at her expectantly. Even Marililla. Van Dien noticed her surprise and smiled. Another thing you might look at. We are a contentious lot in many ways, we Aes Sedai, each jealous of her place and prerogatives. But when someone is placed above us, or stands above us, we tend to follow her fairly meekly for the most part, however we might grumble about her decisions. What do? Adelius murmured happily, as if she had just discovered something. Marililla took a deep breath, absorbing herself for a moment and straightening her skirts. Van Dien is right, she said. You stand above us in yourself, and I must admit you apparently have been placed above us. If our behavior calls for penance, well, you will tell us if it does. Where are we to follow you, if I may ask? There was no sarcasm in any of that. If anything, her tone was more polite than Elaine had heard out of her before. She thought any Aes Sedai who ever lived would have been proud to control her features as well as she did right then. All she had wanted was for them to admit she really was Aes Sedai. She fought a momentary urge to protest that she was too young, too inexperienced. You can never put power back in the cone. So Lily used to drawing breath, she smiled warmly. The thing to recall is that we are all sisters, in every meaning of the word. We must work together. The Bowl of the Winds is too important for anything less. She hoped they would all nod so enthusiastically when she told them what Egwene intended. Perhaps we should sit again. They waited for her before folding themselves back into their seats. She hoped Nynaeve was getting on at 10th so well. When she found out about this, Nynaeve was going to faint from shock. I have something of my own to tell you about the kin. Fairly soon it was Marillilla who looked from shock, and even Adelaide and Dean were not far from it. But they went right on saying, yes, Elaine, and if you say so, perhaps it would all go smoothly from now on. The sedan chair was rocking through the crowds of revelers along the quay.
All right, everyone. I'm gonna call into this live for tonight. Oh, that fucking hurts. Well, I want to thank everyone who stopped by, and everyone who keeps stopping by and chilling. I definitely appreciate all y'all's support. Till next time, everyone. Y'all stay safe out there.